Hello and welcome back. I haven't been on here for a while. I'm going to try to do this more often. Welcome to Harlem and New York City. So I've been asked a lot about price, something that a lot of folks are not into talking about for obvious reasons, but I just want to discuss psychedelics and price. You know, how much does a psychedelic session cost? What's too much? What does it entail, and so forth. So the first thing I got to talk to you all about is what are you looking for? If you want the cheapest, easiest way to go about it, obviously, is paying $50 for or $100 for an eighth, and taking some mushrooms in your basement. Which we could talk about on another video. So that's obviously the cheapest one, but what we're talking about is facilitated sessions. So there's a couple of different ways of doing it. There's an individual, like a one-on-one. There's group, where a bunch of folks do it together, obviously. And those can either be facilitated by a therapist, that's a licensed therapist, someone who's trained as a psychotherapist, for example. Someone who's trained in a shamanistic tradition, or someone who offers it sort of outside of both those modalities, and we'll just call that person a facilitator. And that could be sound facilitation, that could be breath facilitation, but just someone who's an experienced and trained sitter outside of a therapeutic or shamanistic tradition or lineage. So the cheaper way of doing it, of course, is in groups. Groups in the therapeutic tradition of Western therapeutic, psychotherapeutic practices. It's done for a couple of reasons. One, some people really benefit from groups. That's the number one. But also there's an economic reason. Obviously, if you have one therapist and you've got 15 people, it's going to be cheaper for the 15 people, and the therapist is going to make a lot of money. So that is one of the reasons why folks do it in group. Now, there's also, traditionally folks have done it in group, like let's say with peyote, it's often done in a group. But let's talk about group prices. With all of this, with every one of these practices and every one of these medicines, there's going to be a wide disparity in what people charge. It depends on what kind of facilitation you want, what kind of experience you want. You could get an ayahuasca ceremony, for instance, in a group from anywhere from $75 a person per night upwards to $1,500. On the West Coast, I think the medium range is around $250 to $300 a night, and it's usually required 3 nights for first-time sitters. But you can always find sliding scale. So that sort of goes through with every one of the medicines you can sort of think about. Particularly with psilocybin mushrooms, you can find a group that's cheaper than an Aya ceremony often. You can find group settings with peyote and with ayahuasca. Some of the other medicines, it's less likely, but there are people who do groups of MDMA. There's some people that do really large groups, like 30, 40 people, and it only costs $100, $120, let's say. What to look for a group? Is a group good for you? The thing about a group is that it's like the boy with this curl in the center of his head, which I used to have one. It's either very, very good or very, very bad. If you're someone who does well in a group setting, then it might be for you. The thing about a group is that if somebody is having a bad time, let's say weeping hysterically next to you and vomiting, it's going to come into your space. If someone is a little bit exuberant and wants to move, it's up to the facilitator to manage that, but you're gonna get the vibe. What a good facilitator, a good shaman, a good therapist will say is that that's part of the process, your reaction to somebody else. That's true, and a good facilitator, shaman, therapist would help you process that. But they're saying that because that's what's arising. It could also be fucked up. So that's the thing to remember. But it is the cheapest way, and in probably the most democratic way of doing it. So with those medicines, like I said, we're talking about psilocybin, peyote, sometimes MDMA, and sometimes iboga in lower doses. Higher doses of iboga, I don't think it's a good idea to do in a group. So those prices range depending on the medicine. Iboga is much higher because it's a higher threshold. You need to have a medical supervision. If you don't have a medical person there, whether that's a nurse, an EMT, a doctor, or a couple of them, especially in group, then don't go. But those prices range in groups from anywhere from $800 to several $1,000s because it is such a long, intensive process. You've got to remember that people are putting in time. And time is money because people's time needs to be compensated. And then there's the skill level. The skill level of a physician or a nurse or so forth elevates the cost of iboga. So iboga is anywhere from $800 into the thousands. Also, when you're talking about one-on-one therapies, again, a huge disparity. It's going to be more money because someone has got to sit with you from, whether it's 45 minutes for 5-MeO, which is actually a cheaper thing to do. 5-MeO, you should be paying anywhere from $150 to $500. That's 5-MeO DMT. The facilitator has to be with you for 45 minutes to 2 hours. So obviously going to be cheaper. So think about that. How long does someone have to stay with you? That shouldn't be done with a bunch of people, I don't think, but I'm sure someone's doing it. And if it is done with a bunch of people, keep in mind that that's going to affect the trip. It's also going to bring the price down. So individual is going to be more money just because you're paying for one or two, or in a case of Ibogaine, 4 or 5 people to sit with you for several hours. Let's say an hour for 5-MeO, up to 3 days for Ibogaine. So keep in mind that this takes people's times. There's also the idea of, the reality of different practices. So let's say peyote. Often peyote, there is no charge or a donation, particularly if it's done by the traditional stakeholders, the people who, folks from the natives of this continent. It's not in their tradition to accept money. Whereas something like iboga in Mbwiti and in Central Africa and with many African traditions, it is part of the process to pay a healer, to pay a ganga, a mambundi. So expect higher prices on that. Also, really differs between the type of medicine. Like iboga, very high. Psilocybin, just because it's going to take that 6 hours, an individual session, will probably run you anywhere from $400 to several $1,000s, up to $3,000. It also depends on where you are, where in the country, what's the cost of living. New York City, it's going to be a lot more money, obviously. MDMA, similar. It's going to take about 5 or 6 hours, and you have to compensate someone for their time. If you had a plumber staying with you for 5 or 6 hours, what would that cost you? What is the skill set of the individual? Again, anywhere from $400 to several thousand, $3,000-$4,000 for MDMA. Ketamine is increasingly becoming more and more available, administered by a medical professional. In New York City, there's been a push by a company that's advertising, and they're doing it for, I think, around $350 to $400 per session, and asking that you do 4 or 5. So I think the whole thing is like $1,100 over the course of like a month or two. But you can expect to pay in some places up to $700 or $800 or $1,000 per session for ketamine. Ayahuasca individual is going to be a lot more. Less time than iboga, so less money. So you could do it in a group, and that could be a good thing. And peyote, I think there's a tradition of being able to do that for very low cost. The thing that you want to look for is what's affordable to you, but when it's also safe. Really check it out. Feel out the vibe. There's all kinds of really good people doing it. There's all kinds of people that aren't so good. Here's the other thing. Always see if there's a sliding scale. I have been doing sliding scales for the entire time I've been doing this. Most people do a sliding scale of some kind. And there's some people that you just simply can't afford, and that's okay. There'll be someone who you can afford. Look around, do your research, ask folks, get on Facebook groups, ask about the individual, Google and all that stuff. And also, just be really careful. The next video we're going to do is about purity of the medicines, but that's all I got. If you got any comments, any questions, just put it in the box below. I hope I answered some of your questions. And just to regroup, just to go back over it, it varies. It can be cheap and it can be expensive, but don't let that discourage you. You can find someone in your price range. Okay, thanks a lot. Be blessed. Be safe. God bless.